Thank you, John. It is my honor and pleasure to introduce our presenter for this evening. Over the past year, I've been so grateful to develop a friendship with Chief Richard Biehl. His thoughtful contributions and presentations here in this particular Center for Mindfulness and Public Safety community have been inspiring, and personally, he often leaves me in awe. Richard has been nothing less than a pioneer of yoga and meditation in the law enforcement community. And as lucky as we have been to learn from him, as we will this evening, one of my favorite things about him is his tenacity as a student and lifelong learner in a never ending quest to support the physical, mental, and emotional needs of law enforcement and public safety personnel. I know that Richard has had many teachers, and I'm certain that we'll learn about some of them in our presentation today, but I'm very grateful that he's become one of my teachers. Richard is the former director and chief of police of the Dayton Police Department. He was appointed to this position by city manager Rashad Young on January 28th, 2008, and retired July 30th, 2001, after spending 13 plus years as chief of police and nearly 43 in public and community service. Prior to Dayton, Chief Biehl served 24 years as a Cincinnati police officer, and for the last 6 years of his Cincinnati career, he served as the assistant police chief. Chief Biehl was a former competitive powerlifter and martial artist, and his athletic pursuits included regional, national, and international sporting events spanning 1976 to 1992. And nearly 30 years ago, Chief Biehl began to practice yoga as a means to emerge from 2 years of chronic depression. In 2015, Chief Biehl authored the chapter Trauma in the Theater of the Body that was published in the book Moving Consciously, Somatic Transformation Through Dance, Yoga, and Touch, which discusses the potential of yoga to mitigate and heal trauma. In 2020, Chief Biehl completed a master's degree in mindfulness studies at Lesley University. He has presented an introduction to mindfulness practice to several conferences and local workshops, and he incorporates mindfulness within his yoga teaching. Thank you for being with us here this evening, Chief, and we're all looking forward to this presentation.
Well, thank you for that gracious introduction. Is my mic working, by the way? Good, okay. So this presentation, I am going to try to move through somewhat briskly. The reason then the slides were the PDF version of this was provided in advance to give you some potential look at the content prior to that may facilitate conversation thereafter. So just an overview of some themes we have here for this particular presentation. Most of us are going to experience traumatic events at some point in our life. We are greater than its experience and its related narrative. Traumatic experiences are not fated to become traumatic illness. And trauma navigation, resiliency, and cultivation require both bottom-up and top-down approaches. And somatic embodiment and regulation are integral to this process. A little bit of an overview of the presentation. There'll be a brief conversation of describing resiliency and trauma. Then talking about trauma navigation and mitigation, bottom-up versus top-down approaches. Embodiment is a foundational to trauma recovery and resiliency cultivation. And lastly, somatic approaches to accomplish peace, ease, and balance in the body, the words I frequently would use in my yoga teaching. This is an excerpt from a promotional video from Heart Math Institute on their Resilient Heart program. So I think this captures so powerfully the challenge around trauma. So that's why I wanted to share this with you.
All of us have been born into a pre-traumatized field. I have been taught, trained, and educated by people that at least have a certain amount of inner fragmentation in the nervous system. That is what we call trauma. So I'm actually trained to see a world that is fragmented. main story is how we are all swimming in the water of trauma.
We cannot address trauma without the heart. The heart is at the heart of healing trauma and understanding it.
Sometimes you have almost a sense that like their whole house is on fire. They're coming to you and they feel like they're sitting in a house on fire. So what would we do if we are in a house on fire? Get out of here. And that's the instinctive direction of clients with trauma. They want to get out of here. And out of here means out of that body.
Most people that have survived trauma have lived in an existence of being closed off, shutting off more stimulation, shutting off relationship as a protective measure. So when they use heart breathing, it opens up their world.
So that is actually this intro to the Resilient Heart, which is a training to actually teach some of the methods of Heart Math Institute and cardiac coherence, and as a means to overcome trauma. So what do we mean by trauma? I particularly like this comic. Doc, enough with the English. Just give it to me in plain academic medical terminology. So if we were to do that, we would be borrowing from actually the most recent version of DSM-5, which is a DSM-5 TR, which stands for text revision. However, we're not going to go there. I'm picking a more, I think, user-friendly definition of trauma that comes from SAMHSA, and that is this definition here. Trauma refers to experiences that cause physical, psychological stress reactions. It can refer to a single event or multiple events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically and emotionally harmful or threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's physical, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And a quote from Peter Levine, a pioneer in traumatology: trauma is a fact of life. It does not have to be a life sentence. This is a couple of quotes from a book by Ursula Wirtz, and I found it quite powerful. I wrote about the descent into the depths to retrieve the lost and dismembered fragments of the soul, to remember life before the trauma, to integrate life after the trauma, and to hope for life beyond trauma. And then she describes the personal experience of trauma, the visceral inner experience of trauma. The psychological concept of self-regulation and control and the consciousness of being an autonomous, intentional human agent no longer hold. Being helpless, handed over, determined by outside forces, these are the coordinates of traumatic experience. What is the impact of that? Well, it impacts us on multiple domains of our experience: physical, emotional, behaviorally, spiritually, and also cognitively. This particular slide is from the work of Elaine Karras Miller, who had an opportunity to meet and actually undergo her training right after the Oregon District mass shooting. She and her partner, Laura Leach, have both developed a trauma resilience model that is based on the work of Peter Levine and the somatic experiencing. It has the 6 skill sets that are not considered part of a therapeutic model. So, Laura Leach calls her social resilience model. Elaine calls her a community resilience model, and I particularly like that framing. So what is the reality? What happens to us when we get outside of our resilience zone? I might add that this was previously coined by Dan Siegel. It's called the window of tolerance. I like the reframing of it as a resilience zone. But what happens when we get outside of our ability to cope with life as it's unfolding, we can either go in one of 2 directions: hyperarousal or hypoarousal. So basically going into chaos or shutting down. That's what happens to us. This is a brief clip from the American Institute of Stress. The segment is the fourth segment of a 6-segment series, Resilience for First Responders. This was based on an interview that I gave in terms of background information regarding policing and resiliency in early 2019, before many tragic events unfolded, both professionally and personally.
And some parallels can be drawn between police officers and combat troops.
The level of violence clearly is different in combat than in policing, but it's the level of violence in policing that it happens almost on a daily basis.
Let's bring you some breaking news now about another mass shooting in America. Police have confirmed that 9 people have been killed and at least 16 injured in a mass shooting in Dayton, Ohio. The gunman is now also dead.
We went to sleep with the news of those 20 people dead in El Paso. You are waking up now. I am so sorry to tell you, to 9 more people who've been killed in a second mass shooting, this time Dayton, Ohio.
9 people killed, including the shooter's own sister. As to whether or not he shot her deliberately,
some are saying absolutely not. He was not intentional. Some say no, it had to be. I would say it's inconclusive.
Police quickly moving in, taking him down in the doorway to Ned Peppers. In just 32 seconds.
Exposure to repeated traumatic events over time can, we call vicarious trauma, secondary trauma can occur. And I'll return to that topic a little bit later.
And some parallel.
So what are the elements of trauma-informed care? I think that's important. In fact, you may recognize some of this in literally how the mindfulness practices are modeled here within this particular convening. So first, it needs to be safe. There needs to be safety, psychological safety, physical safety. There to be trust developed between those individuals who are seeking to help those suffering from trauma and those who have experienced it. Needs to be collaboration. So this is not a I say you do, and that's why a lot of it's invitational. I invite you to. You'd use that in my yoga practice, in my teaching. I invite you to, and I invite them to explore their own rhythm, their own breath, their own movement. So allow them to be a viable participant and follow their own intuitiveness and what's needed for them in the moment. Choice, having agency. The first thing that is robbed from someone who experienced trauma is a sense of agency, that they were able to do any damn thing about it. And in empowerment, I think empowerment is really all of those previous elements well coordinated. What's resiliency? It's the ability to identify for the individual the collective strengths to live in the present moment and to thrive while engaging in a task of daily life. Resilience 4 means being aware of our ability to return to the resilience zone when we are bumped out. And lastly, getting individuals to recognize the difference between sensations of well-being and sensations of distress, and develop the ability to cultivate those sensations of well-being. You might think of that as even loving kindness practice, but that's cultivation of a skill of unconditional friendliness towards self. So the resilience zone, well, we kind of already talked about it a little bit, but what is it? It's a state of being, well-being in mind, body, and spirit. And it doesn't mean we're not affected by what's happening in our lives, that we don't get angry, that we don't feel sad. It's just that we are not overwhelmed to the point that we can no longer function meaningfully in engaging life as it unfolds. So top down versus bottom up. There's a study by David, Zachary, and Burke, and I'll come back to that study a little bit later, but they basically say This is the DSM-5, so it is not the TR, but I doubt the TR shifted this very much, but it states that trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, psychotherapies include cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure therapy, and they're considered the first line of treatments for patients with PTSD. What was really extraordinary that within their introduction to this whole study, they also mentioned that many of those who have received a PTSD diagnosis, even when benefit from those therapies, quote, retain their diagnosis. In other words, they're still considered to be suffering from the condition. That ought to cause us to pause and question whether or not top-down approaches are really sufficient, or at least sufficient for everyone. Now, they theorize that mechanisms of actions for these treatments include the modification of cognition, so thoughts about herself, the trauma in the world, so trying to reconstruct what Siegel calls a coherent narrative of life now, post-trauma, is pretty critical. And this is what these therapies, some of the things they focus on. Reduction of maladaptive behavioral strategies and the autobiographical integration of trauma memory via therapeutic dialogue, writing, and imaginal or in vivo trauma reminder exposure. I do want to point out that Bessel van der Kolk said it is not necessary to remember the trauma to heal it. So a lot of trauma therapy is about memory, traumatic memory integration. Some folks don't have a memory. They have all the physiological, emotional, somatic effects, but they don't have a memory to go with it. So I was really impressed when Bessel van der Kolk said, you don't have to remember to heal. I thought that was an important point. Yet, these psychological approaches to treating trauma that are cognitively based, and this is Elaine Karras-Miller, they may not lead to nervous system stabilization, which is critical for recovery. So a real pioneer has been Stephen Porges, who more than 20 years ago now developed something called polyvagal theory. And that has probably one of the most important theories that has helped informed our understanding of trauma over the past 20 years, and it's spawned a whole bunch of research. He was basically involved in this creating environments, creating environments of safety and trust through polyvagal theory in the collective trauma summit that I happen to be observing parts of. Said polyvagal theory emerged from basic research. It's the landscape of what our nervous system is and where it came from. So our evolutionary history. He said that in trauma, we are challenged to survive. We go down through older, more foundational survival mechanisms. That often is very confusing for people who are witnessing a person who is in traumatic reaction, because their behavior is so inconsistent with who, quote, they, quote, normally are. Polyvagal theory is the quest to feel safe. And in trauma, the physiology rules, not the intention, to act in alignment with our ethics or values. It is such a reactive way of responding to what is this overwhelming threat. A lot of times it doesn't make sense what people even do. So there's a need to convince our body that it can be safe enough to be in proximity of another so we can trust and so we can love. And lastly, you can't be a co-regulator of anyone if your body is in a state of threat. These are all comments that I listened to and made note of listening to that presentation by Stephen Porges. So his first book was Polyvagal Theory, and this one's called Polyvagal Safety, published, I think, maybe 3 years ago. So the work of Ogden and her associates in trauma, talking once again about top-down, bottom-up processing. Cognitive processing, conceptualizing, reasoning, meaning-making, problem-solving, decision-making is inextricably linked with our bodies. And for traumatized individuals may be overridden by emotions and sensations. In order to treat the effects of trauma on all levels of processing, somatically informed top-down management of symptoms, insight and understanding, and bottom-up processing of the sensations, arousal, movement, and emotions must be thoughtfully balanced. In my view, it's not either or, and it's just not my view. It's not either or, it's both. Peter Levine had did a lot, certainly, to shape my view of trauma and its mitigation and remediation, and so I'm sure so many other people. He's been a traumatologist now for more than 40 years. He said this about trauma. He states it's the conjoined twin sisters of embodiment and awareness that are the key to recovering from a traumatic event or traumatic illness. It is our embodied state and our awareness of it that allows us to interact with both the physical and social environment of every day, and as the resonance of our felt inner and outer sensations that we are able to know ourselves and each other. And he follows, yet it is the other twin sister awareness that holds the key to embodiment. Levine notes that it is only by learning to be, this should sound very familiar, mindfully aware of the moment-to-moment goings on of our body and mind that we can know ourselves, and thus, by extension, begin to heal trauma. Ultimately, it's the focus of awareness on our inner sensation, along with fortified tolerance for bewildering and frightening body sensations that both prevent and alleviate distressful emotional and physiological states. And that is an excerpt from an academic paper that I wrote back in 2017. The healing trauma and building resiliency, is Qigong a potent remedy? Now, another excerpt from the American Institute of Stress about vicarious trauma. I had a period of chronic depression, almost 2 years in my late 30s from an acute personal loss. And I was in pain every single day, physical, emotional pain every single day. And I needed a way to find a way out of it. And I can tell you the counseling practice or approach did not work. I remembered a particular incident early in my career, driving down 4th Street in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I just felt like certain pieces of me were missing. And that's the only way I could describe it. It was just this strange feeling of something's not quite right. And, trauma can often, feel like that. Something's not right. Something's missing. Like there's a gap in one's inner experience. I was, not amenable to medication. I was looking for something to help me emerge from daily pain. And I had dabbled with yoga in my teens. So my first book I picked up when I was 14, it was called Yoga and Your Health by Sudian. I was the author, one of the authors. And that was my beginning to just dabble a little bit. Then I took some lessons, a little bit of lessons in my 20s, then my 30s. Well, I watched the PBS series Healing in the Mind by Bill Moyer, where it was featured a 1-hour segment on Jon Kabat-Zinn.
He works right in the heart of a modern hospital with patients referred to him because their own doctors can do nothing more for them.
They had acute, or really, which is chronic conditions that were not remedied through Western medical approaches. If they were on medication, sometimes they had to be withdrawn from that medication because of the development of tolerance. Yet they were still in pain. They were still suffering. And so Jon Kabat-Zinn developed an approach that involved mindfulness meditation and a gentle form of yoga, and also something called body scan, so kind of a mindfulness practice of using the body as a principal mode of awareness and attention.
Because very often we go through life on a kind of automatic pilot basis, and we kind of aren't even aware that there are all sorts of thoughts going on. They're not subliminal, they're just there, slightly beneath the surface of awareness, but they actually drive many of our actions and behaviors. Did anybody notice that this week?
And there was incredible benefit from those who participated in that training. Some had complete remediation of symptoms, others had significant improvement thereof, so improved quality of life. And that really was the key for me to once again go back to my yoga dabblings. So I went to a bookstore, I bought a yoga book, I opened it up, and I just started practicing. And all of a sudden I realized I had a day without pain. And then before I realized it was multiple days without pain, then it was a month without pain. It is without question the singular thing of great significance I did to emerge out of depression. So it was a lesson I never forgot. So it's been a part of my toolkit ever since. So actually, I would say that the depression I experienced was really a combination, which is almost impossible to separate our personal lives from our professional lives, and particularly when you have traumatic events from both. All I can say is watch out, because that is going to be one hell of a ride. And that certainly was my experience. Pain can be an incredible motivator. It was certainly one for me, seeking a way to get out. It took me 2 years to finally find a way. But I would not wish individuals to have to go through that journey. I would prefer for them to develop the skills beforehand. So just a couple excerpts from the chapter that I wrote. But basically, I'd say I know personally how somatic experience can help one emerge from the depths of depression and daily pain through conscious movement, illuminated through a felt sense and combined with elongated rhythmic breath. And further, how practices of moving consciously when cultivated over time allow the development increased capacity to be with and resolve intense physiological and emotional states, an inherent part of the recovery process. Actually, the very thing that Peter Levine, in essence, said about awareness. So that second quote. And there's a quote from Donna Farhi, who is a really well-known yoga teacher, about this welcome vessel of breath. And you may recognize her framing of it without trying to control, grasp, or push away. Sounds very much like mindfulness, does it not? So going back to this study by Davis and his co-workers or his co-investigators. So physical interventions that galvanize the body into action may hold a significant potential to bridge the gaps in unmet PTSD treatment. And by countering maladaptive responses to trauma and stress, by providing opportunities for mastery, pleasure, competence that restore trust in the body. And I really emphasize in yoga practice, find ways in moving that are pleasant, that truly is the antidote of one's experience of trauma, which is feeling as if the body is the enemy, because all of the uncomfortable, somatically intense experiences. How do we once again experience pleasure and pleasantness in the body? Also, by mitigating trauma-related stress, by countering ineffective avoidance coping, experiential avoidance, by providing a therapeutic context for trauma survivors to reapproach habitually avoided, albeit safe. So we want to maintain that level of intensity in a realm that someone doesn't go into intense dysregulation. Internal experiences, bodily sensations, feelings, and thoughts. So acting directly on the physiological mechanisms of PTSD morbidity. And they basically looked at 84 studies, and nearly 2/3 reported statistically significant reductions in post-traumatic stress symptoms. Now, because of the heterogeneous nature of the various means, whether it was yoga, whether it was swimming, whether it was qigong, whether it was running, they could not parse out which one is swimming better than yoga. They couldn't make that level of differentiation. They only could say a very global sense that there was this benefit. A different study by Schaefer and her colleagues, this is movement and emotion. This was really fascinating for me to come across. They basically found that emotions were associated with various postures and physical movement. For instance, they found feeling angry is predicted by advancing, and a very strong and sudden direct effort is considered an advancing emotion. They found that feeling fear is predicted by enclosing and condensing the body, as well as moving back in space and retreating in the shape of the body, leaning backwards with the torso. And feeling sad was predicted by movements that were done with a passive weight, sinking head down and arms to the upper body. And the feelings of happiness were predicted by jumping and rhythmic movements that are a fundamental part of folk dances all over the world. And happiness was also predicted to be enhanced by lightness and free flow. So you really can think of some of those movements. People would say, you move so gracefully. I am really working to mimic and create a sense of lightness in the body as I'm moving. So a very sense of gracefulness, not this harsh back and forth angular motion. But this was the really fascinating part of this study, the last part. Another finding that deserves attention was that rhythmicity, so rhythmic movement, was not only a positive predictor of happiness, it was a negative predictor for all other emotions. In other words, it would dampen the effects or the potential for anger, for fear, sadness. I thought that was incredibly powerful because I was always emphasizing my yoga practice rhythmic movement. In fact, instead of static postures like Warrior Two, where the arms were held, I changed that into a flow with breath, in and out, lifting of the arms. I made it rhythmic. Another avenue here, this is the work, once again, of really Heart Math Institute. So it's cardio coherence, self-regulation, and basically psychosocial well-being. They basically cited this: the practice of techniques that increase cardiac coherence associated with an experience of intra and interpersonal synchronization, social harmony, and wholeness. So this process of repatterning through intentional activation of positive emotions, and I'll get that in a minute, and generating an increased consistent state of psychophysiological coherence brings about the possibility for addressing the primary defining components of the experience of trauma, thus allowing individuals to move in a state of harmonious, synchronized, healthy function, both at the individual and other keywords, social levels, because we co-regulate. We just don't self-regulate. We need both avenues. So this cardiac coherence, they found a number of benefits that this basically vagally generated heart rate variability. So that vagally means it's the vagal nerve. HR is heart rate variability, was associated with self-regulation, social emotional regulation, et cetera, et cetera. These were benefits that had been cited in prior research. And then this is the heart-focused breathing, which they have really, they've been in this work for more than a quarter of a century. I think it's now more than 30 years. They have been regular vendors at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference. I don't know how many folks necessarily paid attention to that, but I think it's pretty important. So heart-focused breathing, which includes putting one's attention in the center of the chest and the area of the heart, and imagining the breath flowing in and out of that area while breathing a little slower and deeper than usual. This conscious regulation of one's respiration at 10 seconds rhythm, roughly 5 to 6 breaths per minute, increases cardiac coherence and starts the process of shifting into a more coherent state, influencing the neural systems involving and regulating sympathetic outflow. Sympathetic nervous system is that flight-fight part of our autonomic nervous system, and informing emotional experience and synchronizing neural structures underlying cognitive processes. Literally regulating breathing at certain slow breathing rates creates a coherence and an escalated heart rate variability, which is optimal to have it higher, not lower. Low heart rate variability is linked to mood disorder as well as cardiovascular risk. But in doing so, it even affects the cognitive processes. So this resilience, this coherence, so these are domains of resilience, and coherence is when all of those are aligned. And that is the intention of this heart-focused breathing practice while focusing on cultivating positive emotions. In terms of regulated breathing practices, I had an opportunity to study with the doctors Gerbarg and Brown in the spring of 2018 in preparation for an independent study course that I developed called Mindfulness of Breathing, the intersection of yoga, Buddhism, and Western neuroscience. And it was a comparison of The breathing within, mindfulness breathing is taught under the classic teachings of basically the Anapanasati Sutta, this ancient text, as well as comparing it to yoga breathing. And what was the difference? Because I had so much different experience through yoga practice than mindfulness meditation. There was a distinct different quality of experience. And I had to ask myself why. So this was a deep dive into find out why. And I studied with these two leading psychiatrists who have been teaching alternate means to address trauma. So the coherent breathing is an equal breath. The 3.5, the lower end of that spectrum, is for people over 6 feet tall. That's why it's the lower end there. Equal inhalation, exhalation, no real pauses, and it's like natural breathing, quiet and gentle. Resistance breathing, you're familiar with that. We often engage here in straw breathing, which is that resistance to the out breath. In a different form of yoga breathing, ujjayi pranayama, it's a resistance both on the in breath and the out breath, but the greater benefit seems to be on the out breath. So straw breathing would be an example of this resistance breathing. Breath moving is just using imagery of imagining light moving, say, from the base of the spine to the top of the head to the base of the spine, and then out through the body. So it's using one's imagination and light, and anything else that we could do visually use in terms of the breath moving through the body. And the last 4-4-6-2 is inhale 4, hold 4, exhale 6, hold 2. And then that pushes us more toward the parasympathetic state because it's a longer exhale relative to the inhale. Why slow breathing as opposed to rapid breathing? Well, slow breathing avoids the possible risk that can come along with rapid breathing, such as inducing panic attacks. These are people who have pre-existing conditions, anxiety, flashbacks, seizures, increasing either asthma or shortness of breath, increasing blood pressure, generating maybe manic episodes or causing pregnancy risks. There's a link here. These were performing artists that all talked about using breath as a supportive modality for their personal and professional performance. I love this website. I fell upon it. I just provided for you as an interest, a link for perhaps later. And if everything I've said up to this point, for some reason, isn't compelling in towards of making sure we're doing bottom-up approaches as well as top-down, perhaps the following experts will convince you this is so. I never tire from watching that. And there's all the references, should you want to probe those further. And I know this took a while, probably felt like drinking water from a fire hose. So I appreciate your patience with somewhat detailed and lengthy presentation.
Wow, thank Ah. John, you there?
Yeah, Richard, would you be willing for us to open this up and see if there are comments, contributions, questions that may come your way from all of this
Absolutely.
information? And thank you so much for preparing that and bringing that to us.
Yeah,
Such
absolutely. Incredibly informative. Good to see you, Robert. Welcome.
So let's do that. Please, everyone, feel welcome to unmute your microphone and you can speak forward. If you'd like to use the chat, you're welcome to open up the chat and put anything you'd like in chat, a word, a phrase, a sentence, a question.
I have a question. You know, you shared that you sought out yoga in response to that you were suffering from depression, and as a result of both professional and personal exposures, and to difficult, challenging life situations and traumas and so forth. And it sounded like you got some immediate relief. But I wonder if you could just say more about your path of healing. You know, the length of it, the modulation of it, you know, whether it was continually progressive or whether it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and so forth. And the what you feel were the most effective modalities, including the yoga and mindfulness practice and maybe the heart math work, whatever you were doing.
Actually, excellent question. And because I actually wrote about that very recently, once again, in a paper I wrote. But for at first, I really didn't fully understand what I was doing when I was opened this book and began to practice. However, it was movement. It was truly movement that was the most powerful initial intervention. And I was a competitive martial artist. I was a power lifter. So very disciplined, but none of that prevented me from having depression. None of it. It did not save me. And so it was, but I was so just with frightening, quite honestly, spending time in my thoughts. So I had to come to some place that I was more familiar and where I felt more at home, and it was in the body because of all those physical disciplines. And literally, it was the movement that generated the initial relief. I went and eventually took an Ashtanga yoga intensive, and that became my practice for about 6 years. For 6 months during that practice, I thought, I wonder if you could die doing this, because I felt like I was dying doing it. And then all of a sudden I realized throughout so much of that practice, because it was a very complicated practice, it's an hour and 15-minute long primary series, but I was holding my breath through a lot of that practice. And when I finally, after 6 months, realized I was holding my breath, instead of breathing in synchrony with the opening and the closing of the body, once I realized that and began to breathe in a more thoughtful, mindful way, what felt like I could potentially die doing it, it became virtually effortless. Effortless. The final piece was mindfulness. It took me really a while, and it was yoga that helped me cultivate that. I studied with Beryl Bender and Tom Birch, and I remember Tom saying, you know, when you've lost your breath, you've lost your mindfulness. And because in his practice, it was Ujjayi pranayama, it is this resistive breathing, this ocean breath that's done throughout the hour and 15 minutes of practice. So also when you realize you weren't doing the breathing anymore, you realize you lost your mindfulness. So it was movement, breath, and then awareness. Now, experiences I had in life still I found myself going back into depression. When I would begin to beat myself up, well, then all the judgment comes in. Well, you're not any better. Look, you're depressed all over again. You're not any better than you were. Until I got a little distance from that. And I realized, well, when's the last time I was depressed? Oh, months ago. Well, how long did it last this time? 2 days. Change the script. I am getting better. But that doesn't mean I can never become depressed again. That's not the metric. What ultimately developed was the ability to recognize the downward spiral and basically do what Goldstein calls the wisdom of no, saying no to the experience. If I could catch the downward slide soon enough, I could say no to the journey. That was the beginning of true freedom. It's great to have a way to get out of the soup. It's better not to go in. And mindfulness or cultivated awareness was the ultimate resource in preventing going into. So that's kind of how it unfolded. And I said, basically, it's move, breathe, attend. Move, breathe, attend. Not just any movement. I'm talking about rhythmic movement, rhythmicity. That it's not any breath, it's synchronized breath along with movement, and particularly elongated breathing, and not just attending with mindfulness. That was the path.
Wow, it's very, very, very helpful. Yeah, just an aside, there was a time when I dealt with episodic kind of depression and binge substance abuse and alcohol in my life way back in my 20s and early 30s, and teachers that one kind of what would start to bring one of these episodes on. And he talked about from his own experience learning to just make a boundary with it, to say no to it, to just not go there. And it's not really about suppressing. It's not that you don't have to work through your issues and go through all the healing work and do your thing, but you don't have to go down every rabbit hole. And during the years that I spent in incarceration, where the possibility of deep depression was just right over here all the time. It was there. I could see it out in my peripheral. There it was, and I just was committed. I wasn't going to go there.
Mm-hmm.
I really learned it, and it's not there anymore. It was. So that's very interesting. And one more question for you. So embodiment work is really at the heart of what I do. And as you said, people can be involved in regular athletics and sports, which very much involve the body, but still not really have much of a connection to the body or be embodied, right? Still be like most of us living in our heads, in the society we're enculturated to live in our heads. And then even though with yoga and mindfulness, I think many people, they're probably more embodied, but maybe not that deeply embodied unless they have really strong intentionality around it. And to me, that's really understanding the very depths of interoceptive awareness, and that it's actually possible to feel the body. I think it's limitless how deep we can go into the body and the field of somatic awareness that's there all the way down to the bones. And I think unless there's some intentionality around that, even yoga and mindfulness may not be practiced in as embodied way as they could, or even move exercises. So I'm curious about what your journey was of maybe discovering deeper levels of embodiment.
Well, I think it really was so much really the work of Peter Levine that really developed for me this deep appreciation for the wisdom of the body. And my teacher, my longest teacher was Sandra Fraley, who wrote the book From Land to Water Yoga. But she's an experienced yoga teacher. She's a teacher of dance from SUNY, and she is an experienced yoga teacher, and she's also a certified Feldenkrais practitioner. So we learned a lot about creating somatic re-education, moving the body. And it's so powerful, quite honestly, to have someone else move our body for us that allows it to go in different manners of movement that we normally don't move. So all of these were components, but it was really the body, honoring the body more than anything else as a deep reservoir of awareness and ultimately well-being if we can be embodied. I think the problem with so much of the world, we're not. I mean, yoga can be just become calisthenics or gymnastics instead of, as you said, basically developing interoceptive awareness. So the key is the level of attentiveness and awareness we bring to the practice, not how much we can wrap ourselves up in being a pretzel or do these amazing, handstands and things. I've never done a handstand in yoga in my life, folks. Just put it out there. I've done headstands, but I haven't done handstands. So it's really about bringing the awareness. And what I'm trying to work with the students is that, particularly when there are limitations, many people come with they're ailing in some way. Their body is not well. And I say, find that initial point of tension, pause there, and approach it with curiosity, gentleness, and kindness, non-aggressiveness. In the West, we are way too aggressive in how we approach physical activity. We try to make something happen instead of creating an environment to allow what is possible to happen. So it's a whole different approach.
Thank you.
That's great, Richard. Well, I've got 12 or 15 questions for you, but I think we've come to the end of our time. Maybe some other week we'll have more open time for questions and to dig deeper into some of these papers that you presented to us and some of your own personal experiences and approaches. So thank you so much for taking the time being with us. And thank you so much for your own personal work and your own personal healing and bringing that out to law enforcement and first responders throughout the country.
Well, thanks to everyone for your patience and kindness and listening.